I need to begin today's message carefully, because the energy surrounding this first card isn't speaking about someone who simply walked away. It speaks about someone who stayed in the fight long after their heart had quietly begun asking for peace. And somehow, as I look at the Nine of Wands, I don't immediately think about walls. I think about endurance that became invisible. There is a version of you that kept showing up even after trust had been cracked. Not because everything was okay, but because you believed that if you held on just a little longer, eventually someone would notice how hard you were trying. You answered messages that felt heavy. You smiled through conversations that left you emotionally exhausted. You continued giving the benefit of the doubt long after your intuition had begun whispering that something wasn't right. That's what this card symbolizes to me today. Not defeat, not bitterness, but emotional fatigue hidden beneath remarkable resilience. And here's where today's message begins to shift. Because someone who once hurt you is no longer looking at your silence the same way they did before. For a long time, they interpreted your distance as indifference. Your boundaries felt like rejection. Your calm looked like confidence. But time has a strange way of changing perspective. Now they're beginning to realize something they couldn't see while they were caught inside their own emotions. You weren't withdrawing to punish them. You were protecting the last pieces of yourself that hadn't already been worn down. That's an entirely different story. The Nine of Wands often reminds us that survival can become so familiar that we forget how much strength it actually takes just to remain kind. And I keep feeling that this is exactly what happened here. They remember moments differently now. Conversations they dismissed, small pauses in your voice, the nights when you replied with fewer words than usual, the times you said, "I'm okay," even though your spirit was asking for anyone to ask one more question. Back then, they accepted your answer. Today, they wish they hadn't. Because hindsight has begun connecting pieces they ignored. And once someone begins seeing those missing pieces, it's almost impossible for them to return to the story they once believed. And I see someone who finally became honest with emotions they had spent far too long trying to control. That's why the Queen of Cups feels so important. Because the person who hurt you wasn't only avoiding this connection, they were avoiding themselves. Sometimes people believe walking away from a relationship also allows them to leave behind the parts of themselves that relationship exposed, the insecurity, the fear of not being enough, the shame of mistakes they didn't know how to repair. For a while, distance feels like relief. Silence feels like control. Avoiding difficult conversations almost looks like strength. But only from the outside. Reminds us that emotional maturity begins the moment someone stops asking, "How do I escape this feeling?" and starts asking, "Why am I so afraid to feel it?" I don't think they understood that back then. Every day they stayed away became another reason not to return, because coming back would have meant admitting they mishandled someone who genuinely cared. That's a difficult truth for anyone. Our minds become experts at protecting our pride. We rewrite memories, focus on someone else's mistakes, convince ourselves they've moved on, anything that postpones accountability. And that's exactly what I sense happened here. Their silence wasn't peace. It was postponement, not of missing you, of facing themselves. But emotional avoidance always has an expiration date. Eventually life grows quieter. The distractions fade. New conversations lose their excitement. And underneath it all, the feelings that were never processed are still waiting. Patiently, they become deeper, more honest, less willing to accept excuses. That's why I don't believe this person suddenly woke up one day wanting to return. It happened through dozens of quiet realizations. A memory that appeared without warning. A song that brought you back. A familiar place that suddenly felt emptier than before. Slowly they realized your absence had become part of their everyday life in ways they never expected. And the story they had been telling themselves began to collapse. Because accepting the truth in private is one thing. Looking into the eyes of the person you've hurt is something else entirely. That's the battle they're facing now. Not whether they still feel something. Whether they have the courage to let those feelings be seen. The moment when the explanations we've repeated for months suddenly stop sounding true. The King of Cups card gives me the feeling that this is the moment when things start to change for them. Not because something dramatic happened, but because ordinary moments became unexpectedly honest. A quiet evening with nothing demanding their attention. A conversation that reminded them of someone who once listened without judgment. Watching another person make the same mistake they had made, only this time from the outside. And suddenly, they weren't looking at someone else's story anymore. They were looking at their own, not perfect emotions, responsible emotions. The willingness to stop asking whether your feelings are justified and begin asking what those feelings are trying to teach you. I don't think they reached that understanding all at once. It arrived slowly, one memory at a time. They remembered the conversations where you weren't asking for perfection. You were asking to feel safe. They remembered the moments when you weren't trying to win an argument. You were trying to understand why the distance between you kept growing. Back then, they couldn't hear the difference. Now they can, and that realization carries a quiet kind of weight. Because once someone finally understands what another person was trying to say all along, they also have to face everything they never said in return. That's where the King of Cups feels so symbolic. Not because this person suddenly became emotionally wise, but because they became emotionally honest. For the first time, they stopped blaming circumstances, stopped blaming timing, stopped convincing themselves that everything would have ended this way no matter what. Instead, they began asking a far more uncomfortable question. What if I had responded differently? Questions like that don't offer immediate relief. They offer clarity, and clarity has a way of dissolving every excuse we've carefully built around our choices. I keep sensing that this person has been sitting with that clarity longer than anyone realizes, quietly replaying moments they once dismissed, recognizing the patience you showed, the understanding you offered, the chances you gave without asking for recognition. Those memories no longer feel ordinary to them. They feel irreversible. But here's what feels even more significant. As this person has been changing, something inside you has been changing too. And that transformation may matter even more than anything they're only now beginning to understand. For a long time, you believed healing would arrive as one unforgettable moment. One conversation, one apology, one day when everything suddenly made sense. But that isn't how most healing happens. It happens in ordinary moments that almost go unnoticed. The day you stopped checking your phone quite as often. The evening you laughed without realizing they hadn't crossed your mind for hours. The moment you realized protecting your peace no longer felt selfish. It simply felt necessary. The Six of Swords reminds me that emotional rebuilding is often invisible. From the outside, your life may have looked almost the same. You still showed up. You still smiled. You still carried responsibilities that no one else could see. But internally, something was slowly reorganizing itself. Not your love. Your standards. There's an important difference. You didn't stop believing in connection. You simply stopped believing that love should require you to abandon yourself. And I think that's the transformation they never expected. Because people often imagine that if enough time passes, everything will return exactly as it was. But time doesn't only change circumstances. It changes people. The version of you they remember was willing to explain your heart again and again, hoping one more conversation would finally create understanding. The version of you now listens differently. You notice consistency more than promises, effort more than words, peace more than potential. Not because you've become guarded, because you've become honest. And I keep feeling that this is exactly what happened without announcing it, without demanding recognition. You slowly stopped measuring your worth by someone else's ability to see it. That kind of change is easy for other people to underestimate, especially if they haven't watched the quiet journey that brought you here. They may remember the person who waited, the person who hoped, the person who believed love alone could solve everything. What they don't realize is that every difficult day reshaped something inside you, not into someone colder, into someone clearer. Someone who still believes in compassion, but no longer mistakes self-sacrifice for love, which is why I don't think the next meeting between you, if it happens, will feel anything like the last one. Because when they finally find the courage to step toward you again, they won't be standing before the same person they once walked away from. The magician awareness. Because before someone can change what they do, they first have to recognize what they've been creating all along. And I don't believe that awareness came while they still had easy access to you. It arrived after the familiar disappeared. That's often how emotional certainty works. Not in comfort, but in the silence that follows it. There was a time when your presence became part of the background of their life. Not because you weren't important, but because people naturally adapt to those who consistently show up for them. Your messages, your understanding, your patience, none of it seemed extraordinary, while it was still there. Only after it disappeared did they begin to understand its true value. It's like living with music playing in the background for hours. You barely notice it until someone turns it off. Then the silence becomes impossible to ignore. I think that's exactly what happened here. For a long time, they believed they appreciated you, but appreciating someone isn't the same as discovering what life feels like without them. Those are two very different lessons. Once that assumption disappears, everything begins to look different. Conversations replay in their mind. Choices feel heavier. They remember the moments when you reached toward them and they didn't reach back. The conversations they postponed. The vulnerability they overlooked. The apology they believed could wait until tomorrow. It's strange how tomorrow suddenly feels urgent once yesterday can no longer be changed. I don't think this realization happened overnight. It accumulated. One quiet evening, one unexpected memory, one familiar place that no longer felt the same, one instinct to reach for their phone before remembering they no longer knew if they still belonged in your world. That's why they want another chance now instead of earlier, not because new feelings suddenly appeared, but because certainty often grows where certainty once seemed unnecessary. Loss asks questions comfort never does. What did I overlook? Who carried more of this relationship than I realized? What did I assume would always be there? Those questions rarely appear while everything still feels available. They arrive after availability disappears. And perhaps that's the hardest truth of all. Realizing someone's worth after losing them can be genuine. It can change a person. It can humble them. But one question still remains. Is recognizing what you lost the same as becoming the person who truly knows how to protect it if it's ever placed back in your hands? The King of Pentacles quietly steps into the reading, and a question is raised. What does stability actually look like after someone realizes what they almost lost? It's easy to mistake longing for transformation. At first, they can feel almost identical. Someone reaches out. Their voice sounds softer. Their words carry more honesty than before. For the first time, they admit what happened, and all of that can be sincere. I want to emphasize that because not every apology comes from manipulation. Sometimes people truly wake up. Sometimes loss becomes the experience that forces them to confront the parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding. That absolutely happens. But regret and readiness are not the same thing. That's what this card keeps bringing my attention back to. I keep wondering whether the person thinking about you has reached that place yet. Because people miss others for many reasons. Sometimes they miss the love they received. Sometimes they miss knowing someone would always answer. Sometimes they miss the version of themselves they became beside someone who believed in them. And sometimes they simply miss being understood without having to explain themselves. Those feelings are real. But they don't automatically mean someone has accepted responsibility for creating the distance. Responsibility speaks much more quietly than regret. Regret says, I can't believe I lost you. Responsibility says, I finally understand how my choices led to losing you. Those are two very different truths. One focuses on the pain of the outcome. The other accepts ownership of the behavior. As I sit with this card, I don't feel you're being asked to judge them. People can change. I genuinely believe that. But people can also carry old emotional habits into new opportunities. They can promise openness while still avoiding difficult conversations. They can speak beautifully about commitment while repeating familiar patterns whenever fear returns. That's why this moment calls for discernment instead of urgency. Not suspicion, discernment. You don't have to assume they've changed. And you don't have to assume they haven't. You simply allow reality to reveal itself over time. Because real change has a rhythm. It continues after the emotional conversation ends. It remains when the excitement fades. It survives ordinary days, uncomfortable moments, and difficult choices. And I believe the next card reveals exactly how you'll recognize the difference between someone who simply misses having you and someone who has truly become ready to love you differently. And the Four of Pentacles feels like exactly the card that answers that question. I think it's talking about emotional habits because one of the hardest things to release isn't another person. It's the version of ourselves we've learned to survive with. That's why real change is often much quieter than people expect. It isn't dramatic. It isn't announced. It simply becomes consistent. Someone acting from loneliness usually moves quickly. Not because they're trying to deceive you, because loneliness wants relief. It wants reassurance. It wants to restore what feels familiar as soon as possible. But someone who has genuinely grown moves differently. They become more patient, not because they care less, because they finally understand that trust can't be rushed. And that's an important difference. Loneliness asks, how do I stop feeling this? Growth asks, what inside me created this distance? Those questions lead to very different behaviors. Someone driven by guilt apologizes repeatedly. Someone driven by accountability changes the small things no one notices. The way they communicate, the way they listen, the way they stay present when conversations become uncomfortable instead of quietly pulling away. Those changes rarely happen overnight. They're subtle, almost ordinary. The Four of Pentacles keeps bringing my attention back to one simple question. What are they protecting now? Before, they may have protected their pride, their need to be right, their independence, their emotional distance. Now ask yourself whether they're protecting something different. The connection, the honesty between you, the consistency they're trying to build. Because what someone protects reveals far more than what they promise. There's another layer here, too. Sometimes people don't actually miss the relationship, they miss access. Access to your encouragement, your patience, your emotional safety. The quiet certainty that someone understood them even when they couldn't understand themselves. Losing that kind of presence can hurt deeply, but pain alone doesn't create transformation. Reflection does, responsibility does, repeated choices do. And here's what I hope you don't overlook. You no longer have to decide whether their words are true. You simply have to notice who they consistently become. That changes everything. You're no longer trying to predict the future. You're observing the present. One conversation at a time, one action at a time, one ordinary moment after another. That's where your strength quietly begins to appear. Not because you've stopped caring, not because you've closed your heart, but because hope is no longer making your decisions for you. Whatever they choose to do next, whether they step forward with genuine consistency or old patterns quietly return, something has already changed. For the first time in a very long time, the emotional balance no longer rests entirely in their hands. There is something emotionally complex about seeing someone return after you've already learned how to live without the version of them you once hoped for. People often imagine that moment as uncomplicated. They picture relief, they picture tears, they picture immediate certainty. But life rarely moves that way. Sometimes the first feeling isn't excitement. Sometimes it's quiet. You find yourself listening more carefully than speaking, watching more than reacting. Not because you're suspicious of everyone, because experience has taught you that first impressions and lasting patterns are not always the same thing. And the Queen of Swords understands that difference better than almost any other card. She doesn't reject love. She simply refuses to abandon wisdom in order to receive it. That's a very different energy from the person you were before. Because there was a time when hope alone might have been enough. A heartfelt apology, a meaningful conversation, a promise that things would be different. Back then, those moments carried enormous weight. Now they still matter, but they are no longer the entire answer. Because somewhere along the way, you discovered something that pain quietly teaches. Consistency creates safety. Not chemistry, not longing, not history. Consistency. That's why this emotional crossroads feels so significant. If they return, you may notice something unexpected happening inside yourself. Part of you may feel relief that the silence has finally ended. Another part may remember exactly why the silence began. You may feel hopeful during one conversation, careful during the next, curious about who they've become, protective of who you've become. None of those feelings cancel each other out. They can all exist together. And I think that's important to acknowledge because healing doesn't erase memory. It simply changes the way memory participates in your decisions. You can remain open without becoming unprotected. You can listen without immediately agreeing. You can appreciate someone's effort without feeling obligated to rewrite your boundaries. That isn't punishment, it's maturity. And perhaps that's the quiet change they weren't expecting. Not that you've become colder, but that you've become clearer. Clear about what peace feels like, clear about what respect looks like, clear about the conversations that leave you feeling understood instead of uncertain. If they stand before you again, the question may no longer be whether they miss you. It may become something far more meaningful. Does this connection still align with the person you've become while they were gone? And somehow, Ten of Pentacles, who have you become on the journey toward that future? There was a season when love felt like something you had to earn. You measured yourself by how much you could understand, how much you could forgive, how much of yourself you could quietly set aside in order to keep someone else comfortable. At the time, that felt like devotion. Today, I think you see it differently, because heartbreak has a way of revealing where love ended and self-abandonment quietly began. That realization isn't always comfortable, but it is incredibly freeing. The Ten of Pentacles carries a sense of emotional completion that has very little to do with everything being perfect. Instead, it reminds me of someone who has finally stopped building their future around someone else's potential and started building it around their own peace. That's a remarkable shift, because when your identity begins to feel whole again, love is no longer asked to complete you. It becomes something that joins you, not something that rescues you. I keep thinking about the way pain changes over time. At first, it asks impossible questions. Why did this happen? Why wasn't I enough? What could I have done differently? Those questions can echo for months, sometimes longer. But healing has a quiet way of changing the conversation. Eventually, the question becomes something else. What did this experience teach me about the kind of love I deserve? That's a completely different place to stand. Because healing doesn't erase the memories. It changes the meaning you carry from them. The conversations that once filled you with regret begin filling you with clarity. The silence that once felt like rejection begins feeling like protection. Even the moments that broke your heart become reminders of the strength you never realized you were building. And perhaps that's why this card feels so peaceful. Not because nothing painful happened, because what happened no longer defines everything that comes next. You've learned that trust is valuable. Not because it's given easily, because it's given intentionally. You've learned that vulnerability is still beautiful, but it belongs in places where it's respected. You've learned that love should create room for your voice, not require you to make yourself smaller. Those lessons become part of you. No one can take them away. Whether someone returns or not, they remain. And that's why I keep feeling that today's message has never really been about proving whether another person's heart has changed. It's slowly leading us towards something even more important. The relationship you've finally begun rebuilding with yourself. The relationship you've finally begun rebuilding with yourself. And as I look at the Six of Wands, I realize this card isn't speaking to me about victory over another person. It's speaking about victory over the version of yourself that believed your worth depended on being chosen. That is a much quieter triumph. And in many ways, a much more lasting one. Because the title of today's message has never really been asking whether they want you back. It has been asking something deeper. What happens if they do? Months ago, that answer may have felt obvious. Today, I don't think it is. Not because your heart has stopped caring, because your heart has finally learnt to care about you too. That's the change that cannot be undone. The Six of Wands often reminds us that the greatest recognition doesn't always come from other people. Sometimes it arrives the moment you recognize yourself. The moment you stop explaining your boundaries. The moment you stop apologizing for needing honesty. The moment you stop mistaking emotional uncertainty for love. Those moments rarely receive applause. No one else may even notice them. But they quietly reshape an entire life. And perhaps that's the something you need to know that has been waiting beneath every card we've explored together. If they return with sincerity, you'll be able to meet that moment from a place of clarity instead of fear. If they don't, your future is no longer suspended in that answer. Either way, you've already begun reclaiming something that was never meant to belong to someone else. Your peace. I think back to the beginning of this reading, to the version of you who kept trying, who kept hoping, who carried more than anyone realized. That version of you deserved compassion, not because you made every perfect decision, but because you loved with the understanding you had at the time, and the person sitting here now deserves that same compassion. Because growth isn't about becoming someone who never gets hurt again. It's about becoming someone who no longer disappears inside their own love for another person. Pain became wisdom. Boundaries became self-respect. Waiting became discernment. And somewhere along the way, the question quietly changed from, will they come back? To, does my life still depend on that answer? Only you can answer that. But if these cards have been reflecting anything today, I hope they've reflected the quiet strength that has been growing inside you for much longer than you realized. So take what resonates with your own experience. Leave behind anything that doesn't. And if this message found you at exactly the moment you needed to hear it, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for spending this time with me, and if you'd like to join me for more readings like this, you're always welcome here. Until next time, take good care of yourself,